Yeah, I was distracted. I wasn't ready. By the way, good luck getting that out of your head this week. All my life, all I know. It's been in my head for a year. Jordan is correct, at least since camp. We had somebody sing it for us at camp. It was awesome. All right. By the way, this slide behind me is a lie because I totally forgot to put these on YouVersion this week. So you got to use these old school paperback Bibles and follow along. But it's not going to be that hard because we're going to be in another story out of the Old Testament today. Another old school story, old school sermon, if you will. And I just want to say, Jordan, thank you for the songs. Those were fantastic, very good, very awesome songs. And I haven't said this in a while, but you know, it's been really encouraging to see all of these new faces and friendly faces around in person at the building. But also, if you're watching online or you're catching a clip of this or listening to the podcast, we love you guys as well, and we're so thankful that you've connected with us however you can. So thank you for that. We're going to be back in the Old Testament today. In fact, I'm going to go even older in the Old Testament. I'm going to go about 200 years before where we've been in 1 Kings. And in 1 Kings, we looked at Solomon and the two women that charged him with the wisdom of God, dividing the baby, right? And then we went a little bit further in time, and we went to Elijah and how he had had enough. And he cries out to God, and he says, I've had enough. I'm ready to die. And how we can be at those same sort of places in our lives. But today I want to go back, not in the book of 1 Kings, I want to go back to the book of Judges. So we are going to be in Judges today. And I told you guys that I would love to hear some of your Old Testament favorites. And if you think that's because I don't know what to preach on in the Old Testament, I want to let you know I have this document on my computer that is not only a document that I created, but that 20 years of Sunset students have created, and it's 1,500 sermons from the Old Testament. So if you think I'm going to run out of sermons, we're going to be doing this for 20 years. So sorry about that. But no, I'd really like to hear your guys' favorite stories so we can talk about them. And I don't have to pick from this list because I just really, really love to do that. But in the book of Judges, if you're not familiar with Judges, before we have kings, we have judges in the Old Testament. And we go from, like I said, the kings and Solomon and David. If we go back further, we can look at the book of Judges. And one of the judges I'm going to talk about today, his name is Gideon. And something I want you to know about the judges is the judges weren't exactly like kings. The judges were a lot different than kings, and we have a whole bunch of them, again, like the kings, a couple good, but then mostly bad in the judges. But the judges were kind of more like, maybe you could say, the tribal leaders of the nation of Israel at this time. The kings were kings, and these were tribal leaders. But the point that I want you to know is that the judges were the ones that were supposed to be leading the people of God, the nation of Israel, as their leaders. And Gideon becomes one of those judges. But what we're going to talk about today in the story of Gideon is before he is ever a judge. Because we're going to be in Judges chapter 6 and chapter 7 today, looking at the story of Gideon. And so if you got your Bibles, you know where we're going to be. We're going to be in Judges chapter 6 and 7. You can go ahead and open up there, and we're going to hang out in those two chapters today. Gideon is actually one of the famous judges. I mean, a lot of people know his name and are familiar with him. But I actually find the story of Gideon quite comical. I kind of think this is a hilarious story because of who Gideon is and how he interacts with God and the stupid boldness he has against God. He's just like funny to me. Because Gideon, when we pick up in his story in chapter 6 here, Gideon's not in a good place, I think you could say. And we're going to start in verse 11 of chapter 6. Let me turn my page back here. Verse 11 is the first time Gideon is ever mentioned in the Bible. The first time we ever know anything about him. And he's only mentioned in these couple chapters of Judges and then in Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith, right? And so we only have this one story about Gideon, and I find his character absolutely comical. Because where we pick up with Gideon's story and when he enters the picture in verse 11, we can learn about his people, the nation of Israel. If you read the beginning of chapter 6, you will see where they're at and what's going on. I invite you to do that at home. But the short and simple of what's happening to the nation of Israel is they have been invaded and are held captive by another nation called Midian. And so they are essentially slaves in their own land. They are no longer free to do what they want to do. In fact, if you look at the verses before verse 11 here, you can see that the Midianites can come into their crops and wipe them out and take everything for themselves because that's the oppression that they are under as the nation of Israel. And there is one really important key factor why the nation of Israel is under oppression by the Midianites. And it's a statement that's used time and time again through the beginning of Judges. And it's this statement, again, they did evil in the eyes of God. And again, they did evil in the eyes of God. And again, they did evil in the eyes of God. In chapter 6, verse 1, starts off with that same exact thing. The people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them to the hand of Midian for 7 years. Because of bad leadership and because of not turning to God and not worshiping God, the Israelites are held captive by a different nation for 7 years, the Midianites. And so that's where Gideon lives. That's where he's at. That's who he is. He's a man whose own people are oppressed. And I want to start with his story right here at verse 11. Like I said, I find Gideon kind of comical. Chapter 6, verse 11, the very first verse we ever read about him says, "Now, the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianite people." If you had read the very beginning of Judges chapter 6, you could see that the Midianite people can take anything they want from the nation of Israel. And I just got to stop here on verse 11, the very first introduction to Gideon, because we see one of those instances where he is an oppressed man living in his own land under other people, because he is of the nation of Israel, and he is in a winepress beating out wheat to separate the chaff from the grain. Why? So that he can hide it from the Midianites, so they won't take it from him. So where we start off with Gideon is he is terrified. He is terrified and he is cowardly because he is in the bottom of a pit chaffing out grain. I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but when you separate the chaff from the wheat, when you beat it out, as verse 11 says, the most effective way to do that is to have a breeze. And so the chaff blows over here and you keep the grain, right? I've seen some really cool videos on the internet. They just throw it up and the chaff goes over into this pile and the grain falls straight back down, right? It's pretty neat to see that. So you know what's not effective and a really hard way to separate the grain from the chaff? Go into the bottom of a wine press. I dare you to try and separate chaff at the bottom of a swimming pool. It's not a very effective way to do it. And Gideon is doing that. Why? Because he's afraid. He's afraid of the Midianites. And so he's doing extra hard work because he doesn't want to face the oppression. He's cowering in the bottom of a winepress. Pretty mighty man to have a sermon about, right? Not really, not where we pick up the story, but God's got a plan for this guy that is cowering in the bottom of a wine press. God's got a plan. And so if we look at verses 12 through 16, God reveals himself to Gideon in a very powerful way. Read with me here, 12 through 16 of Judges chapter 6. "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor.' And Gideon said to him, 'Please, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, then why has all of this happened to us? And where are all of his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, did not the Lord bring us from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us to the hand of Midian.' And so the Lord turned to him and said, 'Go into this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian.' Do not I send you?" And he said to him, "Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." And the Lord said to him, "But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man." So you could look at verse 11 through 16 kind of as the beginning of Gideon's story. But there's a couple of things I want to point out at the beginning of Gideon's story, just like 3 bullet points for you, okay? We have Gideon. We see Gideon, chaffing out the wheat in the bottom of the wheat press. But the first thing we need to realize is that God speaks to Gideon. It says an angel of the Lord came to speak to Gideon. That right there is a really powerful thing we need to recognize. Gideon's not having a daydream. Gideon's not thinking in his own head that he can defeat the Midianites. In fact, it's the opposite. God is telling him something he doesn't want to hear. But God comes and he speaks through an angel to Gideon, even while he's doing an incredibly silly thing in the bottom of a wine press. And why does God seek him out? Because he desires for Gideon to be the catalyst, the one to free his people, the nation of Israel, from the Midianites. Those 2 things are the most important. God speaks to Gideon, and God desires for Gideon to be the one that'll free his people. But then there's kind of a third thing that I think is pretty funny. Gideon is still absolutely terrified and a coward. In fact, he tries to talk God out of it. Did you notice that? Gideon, you're going to be the one that will free your people from the Midianites. And Gideon says, but my crew we're the weakest. And I am the weakest in my family. I'm just a little old nobody, God. I got nothing. I got no strength. I got no power. I got no political pull. I've got not enough TikTok followers. That's what Gideon says. He gives every excuse of how he is not powerful enough. In other words, he says, God, what can you do with me? Little old Gideon. Little weak, terrified, cowardly Gideon. And I think that this is a really important part of the story because we're going to cruise through what God can do with Gideon. But do we ever ask ourselves this question? I think we do. I think sometimes we are like Gideon in this way. And we look to what God says he can do in this world and we say, God, what can you do with me though? I'm weak. I'm not knowledgeable enough. I'm not influential enough. People don't respect me enough. I'm too young or I'm too old. I'm not educated or I'm overeducated. We'll start coming up with all of the excuses to tell God because we don't think he can do anything with us. What can God do with me? Little old me. Have you ever felt like that before? I hope not. But I think we do find ourselves in that place sometimes. But God said exactly what he could do with Gideon. Did you catch the last verse we read there in verse 16? The Lord said to him, I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. What can God do with me? God says, I can do exactly what I need to do. Because I will be with you, and for Gideon's sake, I will free you from the Midianites through you, Gideon, as one man. What can God do with me? Let's not make excuses for what God can do with us, but rather let's listen to what God is planning to do with us. And it takes a little bit of doing for Gideon to get past this struggle of cowardness and fear and trying to figure out if God is really going to do what God said with, I will be with you. In fact, the next few verses, I can't read them all today because of time, but we see Gideon really putting God to the test. And this is another part of the story I find very funny because some of the tests that Gideon uses are hilarious. He puts out a fleece and he says to God, well, okay, so today if the fleece is wet and the ground is dry in the morning, then I know you really are God. And he's like, I don't know. Okay, that worked, but I'm going to do it the other way around now this time, God. If the ground is wet and the fleece is dry, then I really, he tries to test God to prove that it really is God speaking to him. And I think the reason is because he's still afraid, and he's still a coward, and he still doesn't know if God can do anything with him. But remember, God says, I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. And man, does God show up in the story of Gideon. The reason I love this story is because even though I find Gideon kind of comical, it's not really about Gideon. In fact, it's more about the power of God. Let's read Judges chapter 7, and I have a big chunk I want to read here because I don't want to miss any of the story, because this is all about God working despite what Gideon thinks he's unworthy of. Let's read together Judges chapter 7, verses 1 through 22. Again, hang out with me because it's a big reading, but it'll be really good. Then Gideon and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them, by the hill of Moriah in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, these people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. So therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and only 10,000 remained. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people, they're still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And any one whom I say shall not go with you. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you shall set him by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to take a drink. And the numbers of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. And let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent out all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent. But he retained those 300 men. And the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. The same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Pariah, your servant. And you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. So then he went down with his servant to the outposts of the armed men who were in the camp. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance. When Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade. He said, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it, so it fell and turned upside down, and the tent lay entirely flat. And his comrade answered, there is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all of the camp. As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped. And he returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put trumpets into the hands of all of them, and empty jars with torches inside the jars. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me then shall blow the trumpets on every side of all the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when he had just set the watch. And they blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 300 companies blew the trumpets and broke jars, and they held in their left hands the torches, and in their right hands the trumpets to blow. And they cried out, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Every man stood in his place around the camp, and all of the army ran. They cried and they fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all of the army. And the army fled as far as Bethshittah towards Zariah, and as far as the border of Abel-melech by Tabbath. All right, that's a lot of story with some weird names, so I apologize if I got the names wrong. I had to read the whole story for you, though. Because Gideon is a coward, he's afraid, he's hiding from these Midianites, and he says, "What can God do with little old me?" And I just love, because the rest of the story is God saying, "Watch what I can do with you, Gideon." And I love the fact that Gideon finally believes and trusts in God, and he's got 32,000 soldiers ready to go fight the 150,000 Midianites. He's got 32,000. Maybe he can do it. And God says, "Hey, remember how you tested me? That was pretty funny. Watch this. You have too many guys. You have too many guys to fight that 150,000 person soldier army, Gideon. Ask any of them if they want to go home." 22,000 of them wanted to go home, because I don't want to go die. There's 150,000 people over there. So 22,000 go home, and Gideon is left with 10,000 soldiers. God says, yeah, still too many. Still too many. Remember those tests, Gideon? I've got one for you to do now. Why don't you tell all your guys to go down to the river, to the creek, and take a drink? And we'll watch them, Gideon. We'll see who kneels down and laps up the water and who scoops it up with their hands. And I'll tell you what to do after you count those guys. And so they do the test. 300 men. God says, yeah, those are the 300 that you are going to go fight Midian with. 32,000, too many. 10,000, too many. 300, just right, says God. Can you imagine what Gideon is thinking at this point? He's a coward. He's afraid. He was in the bottom of a pit at the beginning of this story. And God just said, too many guys, 300 guys, that's right. Every logical brain cell in his brain is saying, why does God want us to all go die in 3.4 seconds in the hand of Midian? The math is not mathing. 300 guys, God? And so you can tell in the story that Gideon is still the same Gideon who says, God, what can you do with me? I am terribly afraid. And God reveals to Gideon that God is going to do whatever God well pleases. He sends him down to the camp of Midian and the Amalekites at night. And he says, go watch and listen, Gideon. When Gideon gets there, he hears one of the soldiers telling another soldier about this dream, and then the other soldier's response of the interpretation of the dream. And the interpretation was, Gideon and the Lord are going to defeat us, all of us. And so Gideon hears the enemy saying that, and he hears God saying that, and he worships. The first time we ever see Gideon finally serving the God who is calling him. And so then the story gets epic from there, doesn't it? He goes back, he gets his 300 men, he gives them instructions. He gives them a trumpet, a torch, with a jar over the torch. And he tells them exactly what to do, and they surround the camp of the Midianites. And they all, at the same time, on Gideon's call, break the pots, lift up the torches, shout a sword for the Lord and Gideon, and then they blow 300 trumpets. Again, if you're Gideon, he's finally trusting in God, but this is a pretty small move. You know, they haven't even drawn their swords yet, but Gideon finally trusted in God. Here's what happened. God's plan worked. Some people have speculation on why it worked. I kind of like this speculation that they saw 300 torches and 300 trumpet blows out surrounding the entirety of their camp and saw 300 armies. Because each army had a torch and each army had a trumpet. That makes logical sense, right? But no matter what the reason is, Midian runs and flees, and then did you see they kill themselves? They don't even let the armies attack. They flee and kill themselves before Gideon ever even walks towards them. When you ask, "What can you do with me, God?" God may just reply with, "What I can do is beyond you." Because Gideon didn't do anything in this fight. Gideon's soldiers, 32,000 of them, they didn't do anything. 10,000 of them, they didn't do anything. The 300 he's left with, all they did was declare what the Lord had told them to declare. They didn't pull a sword. They didn't march into the camp, and they didn't kill anyone. God did all of it. What can God do beyond you? Remember, Gideon, he was afraid. He was cowardly. He was the weakest in his tribe and the weakest in his family. And God said, "Don't ask what can I do with you," and responded with, "Look at what I can do beyond you." And so I want us today to be both challenged and encouraged by the story of Gideon. Because Gideon, even though he's in the Old Testament, and this is the story that brings him to be a judge and a leader of his people, no matter what time period he was in, he was just a normal guy. In fact, I would say he's even below a normal guy because of his cowardness and his fear. But God said, "I don't care what you think I can do with you, because everything I can do with you is far beyond you." As Christians today, I think sometimes we will fall into the same pit as Gideon. "I'm not enough, Lord. I've only done this. I only know that. This is all you can do with me." And we put God in a box of limitations because of our human limitations. And what God displays through the story of Gideon is that he does not abide by human limitations. In fact, he works outside of what we think are limitations. And he might work so far beyond us that we don't even have to do what we thought we had to do. And so as Christians today, I think we aren't faced with armies of Midianites, but maybe we're faced with a world full of darkness. Oh, indeed we are. And we are faced with people that don't know Jesus. Oh, indeed we are. Or maybe we're faced with people that know Jesus, but actually haven't read his word to know how to follow him. Indeed we are. And we say, "God, I don't know what you can do with me. I don't know how to talk to people." I think about Moses when he's presented with God in such a powerful way of a burning bush, and he responds with, "But God, I don't talk good. I don't talk good, God. I don't know enough." And God can just say, Gideon, this is so far beyond you. Just watch me work, because it's beyond you. So I want to encourage us today, Christians, if we are the church, let us leave the door wide open for God to work beyond us. Let us leave it wide open for evangelism that we don't know how to do yet. Let us leave the Holy Spirit working in us so that God can work beyond us. Because, man, he can do incredible things with just simple things like a trumpet and a torch and 300 guys against 150,000. So let's not be like Gideon at the beginning of the story, but let's be like Gideon at the moment he worshiped and finally said, "I get it, God. It's beyond